Australian government kept us here in this remote island for more than 3 years.
Good evening again, everyone. Well, we're here in Texas, obviously, as you know, and immigration is a story that is always in the headlines, and even more so, not just here in Texas, but around the country, as news of a caravan of thousands of people fleeing violence and economic insecurity in Central America are just weeks away from reaching the Texas-Mexico border. But I want to turn to an immigration story on the other side of the globe, in Australia. Last Thursday, the Australian government promised to remove the remaining children from its offshore detention site in Nauru. However, just the children are being moved and no adults at this time. And I want to turn to somebody who knows more about this probably than anyone, Viktoria Vibhakar of Save the Children. You're also a whistleblower, so thank you so much for being here. And, let's just start by a bit of location and a bit of geography. Where is Nauru and why are people being taken there from boats instead of going to Australia?
Mm-hmm. Well, Nauru is a sovereign country. It's an island in the Pacific. It's 8 square miles, so it's about 1/4 the size of the Dallas-Fort Worth airport. And it is this small island that Australia uses to house refugees and people seeking asylum, and it's part of their policy of deterrence. It is their way of preventing deaths at sea, according to the government, but what they're actually doing is they're punishing people who are fleeing violence and fleeing persecution by bringing them to these offshore centers and refusing to allow them to claim asylum in Australia. And they're using it to send a message to deter other people who are fleeing violence from trying to come to Australia by boat.
And I mentioned that you were a whistleblower. I mean, tell us a little bit about the work that you did on Nauru and what you saw.
So I worked in Nauru from 2013 to 2014 for Save the Children Australia. I was a supervisor in child protection, and my job was to protect the well-being of children, to investigate incidents of child abuse, as well as to supervise child protection workers. And what I saw was that the Australian government was actually using this holding center not to process their refugee claims, but to make their lives so difficult that they would want to return back to their countries and that they would lose all hope of a permanent future. And when I saw that going on and I saw that children were not safe and they were subjected to exploitation, they were subjected to physical and sexual assault, and the organization that I worked for was not advocating and actually telling the truth about what was actually going on in these offshore centers, I felt morally compelled. I was ethically and morally compelled to report that abuse to the Australian Human Rights Commission.
And I mean, I think that I speak for myself, but probably a lot of people in the audience as well. But I'm relatively shocked at this practice of indefinite detention. One doesn't imagine it would be happening in Australia. You would imagine that it would be sort of much more progressive. But now we have this news, this very recent news, just over the weekend, that Australia's government is promising to remove the children from indefinite detention. Do you think it's going to end eventually? Do you think all indefinite detention will end?
It's hard to say because Scott Morrison, who is now the Prime Minister of Australia, promised to remove children from detention in 2014, and he didn't fulfill that promise because people have still been detained on Nauru. Children, families, babies. And so now he is saying that they will plan on removing them by the end of the year with their families. But I would say, why wait? you have subjected them to this cruelty for 5 years. If you've believed that children need to be removed, why aren't you removing them now? If you know that this situation is so harmful and you don't want to see them detained, he could change it with one stroke of his pen, and he's refused to for 5 years.
And, we're talking about Australia, but obviously detention is something that we're all, I think, unfortunately, more and more familiar with as the headlines of migrant children in the United States have been detained. There are more than 200 children were detained on Nauru. But, as we speak, there are more than 12,000 children currently detained in the United States. And just to get a little bit of a sense of the impact of the kind of work that you've seen and that detention on children has, I just want to play a little clip of children's drawings from inside Nauru. They're obviously extremely distressing images. Can you just tell us a little bit about the emotional state of the children in Nauru?
So the children in Nauru, when I was there, they were losing hope. They were losing hope for a better future. There's no permanent resettlement in Nauru. The Australian government has repeatedly said they'll never come to Australia, but has given them no other options. So what I saw was despair setting in. I saw children wanting to take their own lives. I saw families and mothers unwilling to get out of bed. And when I say bed, I meant an army stretcher in a tent is where they were detained for 5 years in a moldy tent. And I think that one of the hardest things to see was that as time went on, no matter what I provided, what type of support that myself or my colleagues provided, they became more and more despairing. They lost their will to live, and they were subjected to so much harm. For example, the sexual exploitation and sexual harassment in the detention facility was extreme. There was a young woman, a mother, that I worked with, and she had a special needs child, and so she needed help from the security guards often. And what they were doing was, in exchange for that help, they were approaching her in her tent at night, asking for sexual favors from her. We found that her little boy had been outside the tent, was found without any underwear in the middle of the night, and no one could tell why. And he, with English as a second language, in an environment of fear, with a trauma, with a mom who's being sexually harassed, he was unable to tell us what had happened. But we did find out several months later that child did disclose that he had been sexually assaulted. And several months after that, he tried to take his own life. And this is a child under the age of 12. And the Australian government, knowing all of this, refused to move this family. I wrote the incident reports indicating that this woman was fearful for her safety, fearful for her son's safety. And I was told that she couldn't be moved until she had been sexually harassed multiple times, and then maybe she could be moved to a different tent.
This sort of stuff, it's just shocking when you hear this. And again, just to reinforce that we're not talking about, a country, the usual suspects that people would associate. This is Australia. But, the actions of the government seem to be totally antithetical to preserving human rights. The government more recently decided to eject Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, from Nauru. What was the thinking behind that decision? Why do you think that the Australian government are taking such a hardline approach to this particular issue?
Well, it was the Nauru government that expelled Médecins Sans Frontières, and we don't know why, what the thinking was behind it. What they publicly stated was that MSF was advocating beyond what was the scope of their position for refugees, and that they weren't supposed to be providing the type of mental health care that they were. However, MSF has stated in a public statement that they were actually contracted to provide mental health care for refugees. I believe that whenever the Nauruan government believes that people are actually telling the truth about what is occurring to refugees in the detention facility and in the community, that is a threat to them. And that is a threat to the Australian government. And they do everything that they can to keep us from talking. And they have done. They have, they referred me to the Australian Federal Police. They referred doctors to the Australian Federal
Simply
Police.
for speaking out.
For speaking out.
Wow. And, journalists, I mean, you're one of the few people who's actually seen firsthand what people are experiencing on Nauru, women, children, families that are being ripped apart. And it's very difficult for journalists currently to access Nauru. And it's difficult for asylum seekers as a result to actually have their voices heard. But the next clip that I want to show everybody was made by The Guardian, and it features two teenagers describing what life is like.
The detention center that we are living in Nauru is like a prison. We're living behind fences.
When it's raining, the water drips in the room and there are cockroach, mouse everywhere. It's very hot at the daytime and there was nothing for us to do.
There are lots of securities in here and they're like jailers. If they see it, they will take away our phones. I consume washing detergents, poison. I'm just so tired of everything. It was burning all the way to summer. Everyone, including myself, we are getting hopeless.
As someone who's been there, how does that affect you, just sort of being taken back?
It's really hard because these are kids that I worked with or I knew, I saw in the camps. And I think what is so hard about, I know that the idea that children are going to be and families are going to be off Nauru is an important milestone. It's an important victory. But to me, I feel so ambivalent about it. It doesn't feel worth celebrating when children are being taken off in ambulances and because they've lost the will to live. This was something that myself and my colleagues warned the government about, the mental harm, the physical harm that was being caused by detention, and they didn't listen. They could have prevented this harm. And sometimes it feels like a hollow victory.
Obviously, it's still very affecting to you, even as we sit here talking so many thousands of miles away. It must be very hard when you hear people like the former, Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott talk about the fact that he thinks that the conditions on Nauru are, quote, very pleasant, is what he said just over the weekend, actually last week. I mean, what's your reaction to one of the foremost politicians in Australian politics saying that the conditions that we just saw in that video are very pleasant?
Well, former Prime Minister Tony Abbott was one of the chief jailers of these people. And I think he doesn't see them as people. He sees them as less than. That is the only thing that I can think of as why someone would say they're pleasant, because these are not conditions that he would accept for his own children. We all know this. We hold people that come from other countries and flee violence and refugees. Somehow, many people in the US and many people in Australia, and foremost the current government, they have a different standard for what is acceptable for their own families and what is acceptable for people fleeing violence. And I would say, what makes your children worth protecting and somebody else's children unworthy of that protection?
And does it, I mean, in terms of this idea of the policy of deterrence in general, you know, this is something that isn't remote, isn't just in Australia, as we've been talking about, but, you know, it's here in the United States. The Trump administration has been very aggressive in rolling out deterrence policies, whether it be, you know, Attorney General Sessions removing asylum seekers who've been victims of domestic violence from actually being able to now apply for asylum. You know, that there has been this very, very strong policy of deterrence, obviously most poignantly and potently with child separation as a policy. What does the policy of deterrence actually do to children?
The policy of deterrence is something that punishes people for seeking protection, and what it does is it destroys hope. We take children and families and we use them as examples to other people to say, don't do this because this will happen to you, and we hold them up as examples of punishment, and what it does is it breaks down their spirit. So we see in Nauru now, it's come to such a crisis that we have kids with what is coined traumatic withdrawal syndrome or resignation syndrome, where kids have lost the will to live, many of them, so they stop feeding themselves, they stop toileting, they've taken to their bed, they're unresponsive, they don't talk, they don't communicate with their caregivers, with medical personnel, they need help. They need help to toilet, they need to be hydrated through a tube. This is what deterrence does over time. And allowing children to lose hope and allowing them and putting them in a position where they see their families lose hope, when they see their parents commit or try to attempt suicide or self-harm, or the adults around them in the detention facility do that, kids get their sense of security and safety from their loved ones, so much of it. And when that is destroyed, piece by piece by piece, when their mental health is broken down, it causes so much long-term damage to people. And you can imagine what it does to adults as well. When adults aren't able to protect their own children and they're not able to feel that they can offer their children hope of a better future, of a safe future.
Well, we know that, you know, there is going to be some sort of forward momentum on this issue. Australia has already resettled some of the children and some of the adults, and more than 100 of them actually are living here in the United States, some of them in Texas. But it's estimated that there are 70 million refugees worldwide. What, if anything, can our audience do? You know, I think there's a sense of helplessness often when we hear these stories. What can our audience do? What can we do to express support for all asylum seekers and refugees?
Well, I think first let me tell you a story about an asylum seeker I met. So you know the type of people I'm talking about. This man adopted a daughter on his boat journey, and the boat capsized, and instead of letting her go, he threw her overboard, and then he carried her on his shoulders for 14 hours, waiting for rescue. And this man has adopted her as his daughter, and he remains in Nauru. Instead of being called a hero, someone we would love in our communities, instead, he is being detained for over 5 years. And I think it's so important to tell politicians that you do not accept the policy of deterrence and family separation. It's been 5 years that we have been fighting for the tide to turn with the Australian government, and it has finally started to turn, and it's because of public pressure. So I would say, do not let your politicians get off this. Do not let what happened in Australia happen here. You have the largest detention facility in the country in Dili, and there are all sorts of human rights abuses that have been reported there. Get on the phone and contact your politicians, write them letters, and don't stop.
Hear, hear. Well, I think we can all get on board with that. Thank you so much, Viktoria, for speaking out, for your bravery, and thank you for being with us this evening.
Thank you so much for having me.